next up we have Erina, and is this your job market?
Yes,
yes, it is.
A very shortened version of it.
Yeah, obviously a shortened version of your job market talk. Yeah. So lots of comments and feedback will be useful.
That would be great. Yeah.
Effort and selection effects of performance pay in knowledge creation.
So yeah, this paper looks at incentives for knowledge creation, and particularly what kind of incentives are effective in increasing the amount of knowledge that's being created and also quality. And oh yes, sorry, thank you. And also how do they work? So I look at effort selection effects, and particularly of performance pay, and I study this in the context of academia. So I look at basic knowledge creation, but I would argue that some of the lessons hopefully also extend to knowledge creation in a more general sense of innovation. So we have known since at least Romer and Lucas that knowledge creation, innovation is important for economic growth. But there's still a lot of unknowns about what it is that actually drives knowledge creation in and of itself. There's a large literature that looks into this, that looks at incentives for knowledge creation. And some of this literature, for instance, looks at incentives for commercializable knowledge, so looking at patenting, for instance, studying the effect of royalty rates, the relationship with patenting, entrepreneurship, and publications. By and large, this literature finds that royalty rates, for instance, are associated with a higher patenting rate, more entrepreneurship. And there's a large literature that looks at incentives for academic research, so more basic research. And here the results are a little more mixed. So much of this literature looks at, for instance, funding schemes and awards. And some papers find a positive relationship. So, for instance, a higher productivity after the granting of an award or funding, or receiving funding. But some work by Warhus and Ron actually finds that productivity drops, so for instance, field medal. So there are still, as said, quite a few open questions here. For instance, the literature that looks at funding and awards, by and large, cannot really distinguish between the effect of funding in itself, so money, money that allows you to do research, and the actual incentives of funding. Secondly, a lot of this literature cannot really distinguish between a selection effect of incentives, so what kind of innovators are attracted by a certain incentive scheme, and do these innovators or knowledge creators actually produce more output? So is there an effort effect? Thirdly, a lot of this work, and this has to do with the selection effect, looks at relatively more productive innovators. So by and large, people who apply for a patent are relatively more productive, or people who apply for funding are relatively more productive. But what about the effect of incentives on relatively less productive knowledge creators? And finally, what about the effectiveness of performance pay in a more contractible sense in general for knowledge creation? And that's really where this paper hopes to add to the literature. So we know that performance pay incentives are really widespread, both within the context of knowledge creation and innovation and outside of it. And there are effectively two kinds of incentives that you could implement that are there to incentivize productivity. One is implicit performance incentives. So these are career concerns that stem from the effect of current performance on future compensation. So the classic example is promotion. The second type is explicit or more contractable performance incentives. And these are really just incentives stemming from compensation contracts. So for instance, a piece rate type incentive scheme, such as, say, bonuses for publications. These are widespread, but we have little knowledge of how they affect knowledge creation. There is some suggestive evidence, though, that suggests that these incentives do matter. So what I'm showing you here are two figures taken from a paper by Hamel and Oorsprong. We'll look at the productivity of academics over the academic life cycle. So what we have on the x-axis is the years since completion of a PhD, and the output measure that they use here is the quality-adjusted number of publications, so the impact factor rated number of publications. As you see, the number of publications really jumps up right after PhDs. This is actually data for German academics, economists. Jumps up after completion of the PhD, peaks at around 8 years after, which exactly coincides with the average time at which an academic in Germany starts their first tenured affiliation. Drops, and there's another slightly lower peak at around 26 years after completion of the PhD, which aligns with the average age at which an academic receives the second goal in Germany. This is not necessarily a promotion to a full professorship, but there is now such clear distinction in Germany. But it suggests that said, again, there's a ramp up to another promotion.
So Germany, there's two main promotions that you get?
So the real promotion is the promotion to a tenured professor. So the first one, exactly. And then you might get sort of a second call, and that might get you to a higher pay level, but there's no such clear distinction as there is in the Anglo-Saxon system from associate to full professor. But this is suggestive of there still being a reason to actually try and get that second call to move to, say, a more reputable university and potentially have a slight increase in pay. So this suggests that
data for other countries, or is this you only have it for Germany?
So in for
like
America, it looks very much the same, and the second peak is a little bit more pronounced because there is actually the promotion to full professorship. So yeah, it's very
26
similar.
years later, though, that's pretty late, isn't it?
So I think it's a bit earlier in America. Yeah, that's right. But it aligns with the average time at which someone would be promoted to full professorship. So what these pictures suggest is that on the one hand, there seems to be a positive relationship between implicit incentive, so the incentive for promotions, and productivity. And this log here suggests that there might be also room for some extra potentially explicit incentives to try and keep up productivity. So that's what this paper is really looking at. I'm looking at the effectiveness of performance-based incentives for knowledge creation. And in particular, I want to understand which of these two implicit or explicit performance incentives are more effective in increasing knowledge creation. And if they're effective, how do they do this? Is this mostly through selection, or are they just attracting more productive academics, or do they actually increase the output through an increased effort that these academics exert, or knowledge creators more generally? And finally, who responds most strongly, and especially in terms of who increases their effort more strongly? Is it the more productive knowledge workers, or the relatively less productive? So I get at this using the introduction of performance-based in German academia as an actual experiment. And I use this reform because it has a number of nice features that actually allows me to get at the previously mentioned question. So firstly, this reform introduced both implicit performance incentives and explicit performance incentives, and they take effect at different times, which allows me to actually separately identify the effect of these two types of incentives. Secondly, I was able to construct a data set that encompasses the career history, the affiliation history, and the publication records of the universe of German academics at an individual level. So this actually allows me to look at what happens to productivity of not just the most productive academics, but also less productive academics and the profile. Then one feature of the reform, in particular, the way in which the incentives impact different cohorts of academics differently, allows me to actually identify the effort effect in the different spaces. I'll say a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. And then finally, I can also estimate the selection effect, or just sorting into performance space, because again, the reform impact or it creates different incentives for actually switching to the performance-based scheme for academics of different ages. And again, I'll say a little bit more about that when I get it. But just in the very real possibilities that I don't get to the end of my talk, I just want to preview the findings. So I find a positive and significant effort effect. I find that academics who are affected by performance-based increase their output by 12 to 16%, and that's a cautiously estimated 12 to 16%. Now I find the greatest response, or actually the only significant response, to implicit performance incentives. And the only significant and really large response, anywhere in the order of magnitude of 20 to 30% of the relatively less productive academics. So the bottom three quarters of the productivity distribution. And these academics respond not just in terms of number of publications, but also quality adjusted, so impact factor rated number of publications. Yet, I actually find that it's the more productive academics who are more likely to select into performance-based. So it's the more productive academics who sort into or are attracted by the performance-based scheme, but they're not the ones who actually step up their game and increase their effort. But there seems to be an inefficiency there. So before I get to the empirical meat of the paper, I need to give you a few more details on the reform that I studied. So first, something about the incident. The reform that I studied was announced in 2002 and implemented in 2005, and it signaled a change from an age-related pay system in which the wages of professors would mechanistically increase every 2 years until the age of 49, to a performance-based scheme that comprises a basic wage, which is lower at higher ages than the wage that a professor would earn on the age-related pay scheme. But on top of this, professors can earn bonuses for their performances, research, very importantly, teaching and promotion of young scholars. And these bonuses can be very substantial. They can more than double the monthly salary of an academic. The more than doubling is really for the superstars, but it is possible. These are substantial bonuses. Now,
are those meant to have the same average pay? Is it like a revenue neutral?
Yeah, it was exactly. It was budget neutral. So yeah, the average pay was mandated to remain the same. So a little bit more about the incident. So any new contract that is signed as of the 1st of January 2005, when the reform was implemented, necessarily falls under the performance-based scheme. But any contract for a tenured professor that already existed before that time continues to fall under the age-related pay scheme unless it's renegotiated or somehow changed. So I wanted to get some cute pics up here, but then I noticed that Andre does much better pictures, so I'll ask you about that next time. Anyway, here is my dual professor who started the first candidate relation. 2000, she's paid under the age-related pay scheme, and as long as she doesn't move or renegotiate the contract, she remains in the age-related pay scheme. Now, someone who starts a tenured affiliation in 2006 necessarily falls under performance-based scheme, nothing they can do about that. And then finally, someone who, for instance, starts a tenured affiliation in 2003 initially falls under the age-related pay scheme, but then if this person renegotiates that contract or moves to another university, they necessarily fall to the performance base. So what I'll do in order to get the effort effect is I compare two cohorts. The cohort that starts their first tenured affiliation after the implementation of the reform, that is the treated cohort. They necessarily fall under the performance-based scheme. And I compare them to a cohort of academics that starts their first tenured affiliation directly before the reform that still falls under the age-related pay scheme. I'll look at what happens to productivity from before to after to see how academics are actually affect performance-based scheme, the treated cohort, how they change their effort and their productivity.
And so just to be clear, the untreated one, in fact, includes some people who do have performance pay and some people who don't. But yeah,
exactly.
Right.
So the control cohort
together, yeah.
Exactly includes some people who ultimately switch to the performance-based scheme. That actually causes me to underestimate my effort effect. So in the beginning, I said the effort effect that I mentioned here, the 12 to 16%, is an underestimation. I actually show that when I take out the ones who actually switch to performance-based scheme from the control cohort, the effort effect is much larger. So a little bit more about the incentives. As said, the reform introduced both implicit performance incentives and explicit performance incentives. Now, the implicit performance incentives take the form of attraction or retention bonuses. These are bonuses that are negotiated between a candidate and a hiring faculty at the beginning. And what the faculty takes into account really is past achievements and qualifications of the academic. These incentives effectively take effect as of 2002. From that moment onwards, so from the moment onwards that the reform is announced, academics have an incentive to step up their game so as to increase their chances of receiving such an attraction or retention bonus. And of course, this incentive is much stronger if they anticipate that they will start their first tenured affiliation after the implementation of the reform. The explicit incentives take the form of on-the-job performance incentives, and these come into forms here again, performance in terms of research, education, and training and promotion of scholars is taken into account. They come into forms. The first is a tournament pay. So here, academics are compared, or academic performance is compared amongst peers in the same department, and they come as renewal or continuation bonuses. So some of the attraction and retention bonuses are offered for a fixed period only with the option of renewal. If such a renewal option is offered, then a target agreement is signed between the academic and the department, and in that agreement, the academic sets out what achievements he or she will attain, mostly in terms of publications or funding they'll attract. These explicit incentives take effect as of the implementation of the reform, so 2005 and on. So, implicit incentives, explicit incentives. Now, in the interest of time, I'll skip the whole construction of the data set and I'll move right to the effort effect. So as said, I compare the cohort of academics who start their first tenured affiliation directly after the implementation of the reform, 2005-2006, that's my treated cohort, with a cohort that starts their first tenured affiliation directly before the implementation of the reform in 2003-2004. That's my treated cohort. And when I look at the changes of productivity over time between these two cohorts, then any differential change in productivity from before to after the reform I can interpret as an effort effect if the timing of the start of the first tenured affiliation with judges. That's not an obvious assumption, but I'll provide evidence that suggests that this assumption is indeed met. So, what do I get? I estimate 4 measures of productivity, all based on publication records, so number of publications, impact factor, rated number of publications, and those 2 variables weighted by number of authors on the paper. And I regress those in additional rate maximum likelihood of fixed effect regressions on, importantly, a poster 2 and a poster 5 dummy. They capture the implementation of the implicit incentives and the explicit incentives, and those interacted with the treatment. So it's the interaction terms that we're interested in. What I find is focus on the B columns, because the B columns contain a full set of year fixed effects, and they also all contain a full set of year to tenure fixed effects dummies that pick up on any common year to tenure fixed effects. What we see is that the number of publications and the author-weighted number of publications of the treated cohort goes up much more after the institution of the implicit incentives of the reform. So the treated cohorts step up their game once the implicit incentives of the reform take effect as of 2002. And this increase in average is anywhere between 12 to 16%. Now, as I mentioned, the identifying assumption that the starting the first tenured affiliation with exogenous is not obvious. So I want to provide some evidence that suggests that what I'm finding here, this effort effect, is truly because of the introduction of stronger performance incentives. I do this by running a regression with a full set of year to tenure dummies interacted with the treatment. So I basically want to look at what happens to the productivity of the treated cohort and the control cohort and compare how they do in the run-up to tenure and after. This looks like this for the treatment control cohort when I look at just number of publications. So here I show the interaction terms, the coefficient estimate of the interaction terms with 95% intervals, that's the bars. And what these display is really the percentage difference in number of publications between the treated cohort and the control cohort as they move towards tenure. So here I line up their tenure timeline. The green dotted line indicates when the implicit performance incentives take effect. The orange dotted line indicate when the explicit performance incentives. And now keeping in mind that I'm backdating all of the number of publications by the average publication lag in a field, you see that the number of publications of the treated cohort starts to significantly differ after the implicit performance incentives take effect. And
so those dotted lines, they're just before that one or just after?
So it's because I have sort of 2 cohorts. I have academics who start their first tenured affiliation in 2005 and 2006 in the treated cohort.
T minus 4, is that, can we interpret that as being just before?
So this is 2002 for the cohort that makes tenure in 2006. So that's exactly at the point in time where the implicit performance incentives take effect for the cohort that starts that tenure.
So it does include that one.
Yeah,
you might just graphically, you might just move that dotted line a little to the left.
Okay.
So there's not I thought it had something to do with the confidence intervals or something.
Okay. That's a good point. Yeah. Just move it here. Okay.
Yeah.
So we see an effort effect, a significant differential increase in productivity of the treated cohort that also persists quite a way through. Now, this is not nearly as pronounced when I look at the impact factor rated number of publications, which aligns with the baseline results I showed earlier. But importantly, when I simply compare 2 cohorts who both started first tenured affiliation before the reform, so each of these falls under the age-related pay scheme, I should see no differential effect of when the implicit performance incentives take effect or when the explicit performance incentives take effect. So that's my placebo. Here again, I have number of publications as dependent variable. Here, impact factor rated number of publications as dependent variable. And there's no differential effect of the incentive.
So these reforms were done presumably because they thought there should be more performance or whatever.
Absolutely.
And so they implemented this particular change. I'd be concerned, was there a sort of a movement in Germany to let's do things and change the incentives more broadly? Let's talk about it. Let's tell managers to pay more attention to it. Let's start having a value, so there could be other compounded happened exactly the same time as they implemented this.
Absolutely, and that works. So one big potential compounding factor is, for instance, the introduction of a very large funding initiative, the Excellence Initiative. The thing is, in order for that to explain the results that I have here, those other initiatives or those other managerial changes should impact the treated and control cohort. So literally going by when someone starts the first 10 days differentially, and that's very unlikely. And I find no evidence of that in sort of the placebo long-term.
So those two cohorts were not treated differently in any other way other than the tenure thing.
No,
There's
exactly.
no other.
There's no other. Okay. And so when I change the window by which I define my cohort, the results all go through. So we're all robust to that. So yeah. Now, as I foreshadowed in the beginning, this average effect actually hides a lot of heterogeneity. So all of this effort effect is really just coming from the relatively less productive academics. So here what I show is the same regression. So looking at, for instance, the number of publications, but now doing so separately for the top quartile of academics, the most productive ones, and the bottom 3 quartiles of academics, the less productive ones. And literally all of the effort effect is coming from the less productive ones. And their effort effect in terms of how much they step up their productivity after the implicit performance incentives take effect is anywhere in a ballpark of 20 to 30%. Now, are the relatively less productive academics also the ones who are attracted by this performance-based scheme? Do they select into performance-based averaging? Here, I use the fact that academics who started in the age-related pay scheme can switch to the performance-based scheme by renegotiating the contract or moving to another university. So as a first check, I just look at all those academics who had a tenured affiliation before the implementation of reform for 2005, and I simply compare the most productive academics to the less productive ones, which are more likely to switch. So here I show the smooth hazard rates of switching to the performance-based scheme for the top quartile and the bottom 3 quartiles. And the hazard rates, the rates at which the top quartile switches, are everywhere significantly higher than the ones of the less productive academics. Now, of course, it could very well be that more productive academics are, in general, more likely to renegotiate their contract. So in order to distinguish this from the actual selection effect or detraction effect of the performance pay, what I use is the fact that the wage schemes of the age-related pay scheme and the performance pay scheme compare differently. The upward sloping lines are the wage schemes of the age-related pay scheme. The flat lines, the horizontal lines, are those of the basic wage of the performance pay scheme. And as you can see, for older academics, the age-related pay scheme is much more attractive. So we have 2 factors that determine whether someone will select into performance pay. On the one hand, it's how the basic wage compares. And this, for older academics, should be such that especially less productive academics are less likely to switch to the performance-based scheme because they experience the pay cut.
Why not look at the switching behavior before the thing was announced at all? I mean, how often did high-performing people switch in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah. So I find that in general, older academics are less likely to switch, so they're more settled. More productive academics are more likely to switch. So what I'm doing here is using how the switching incentives actually differ by age. I can single out what the effect is of the actual performance.
Yeah, I got that. But was there a change in the propensity of older academics to switch after it was announced? Or more productive academics to switch after it was announced? So if before this was announced, let's say higher performing academics switched twice as often, and after it was announced they switched 3 times as often, that would suggest that this is having a selection effect. But if they switched the same rate before and after it was announced, then that would suggest that this didn't affect their switching.
Okay, so what I have here is only sort of the switching rates of academics who actually initially fell under the age-related pay scheme compared to those who start out in the performance-based scheme, so the ones that can switch from before to after the reform, and only after the implementation of the reform. But the same results go through when I actually look at the announcement of the reform. So in short, I don't find and I've looked at sort of just the likelihood of switching over time as well, and there's no general increase in switching rates after the announcement of the reform, but it really only follows the pattern of
So the reform did not change the switching rates.
So it did, but only along the lines at which it should. So it only makes less productive academics who are older less likely to switch because they stand to lose by now switching after the reform.
They were less likely to switch.
They were less likely to
their
switch.
rates of switching changed.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I showed here. So in a simple Weibull model, estimating the hazard rates of switching, what I compare is the switching rates of those academics who start out in the age-related phase scheme, so the ones who had a tenured position before 2005, with those who started in a performance-based scheme, so the ones who had a tenured position after 2005. And in particular, what I should find is if there is a selection effect such that more productive academics are more likely to switch to performance after, I should see that relatively less productive academics of higher age are less likely to switch to the performance-based scheme because they actually stand to lose by switching, which is exactly what I find. So academics over the age of 46, which is just after the single profit point of the wage scheme, are 8 to 9% less likely to switch to the performance-based scheme, but only if they're less productive. So the more productive ones continue to actually switch to performance-based scheme and are not deterred, while less productive ones are deterred because they stand to lose something, and their productivity cannot make up for that. So I find by and large that more productive academics are more likely to switch. There's no such effect when I do a placebo comparing two cohorts who each started the first tenured affiliation before the reform. Long story short, because I'm out of time, I find a positive effort and selection effect of the cautiously estimated 12 to 16%, and this is really just in response to implicit performance incentives, so promotion incentives. And they're driven by lower productive academics. I find no significant effort effect of the most productive academics. In contrast, it's really only the most productive academics who continue switching and actually select into performance-based. So even though, because of the budget neutrality of the reform, this increase in effort that I find in less productive academics is a pure welfare gain, there's also an inefficiency, because if it were up to the less productive academics, they would never switch to this performance scheme, yet they're the only ones responding in terms of that. And then there's a whole road ahead that I'm looking at. I'm actually trying to figure out how novel the knowledge is that the academics create from before to after the reform. So one of the concerns is that the extra publications that academics produce after the reform is just a regurgitation. It's literally putting the in research, as Scott Stern said, and trying to figure this out for later.
So there's another selection effect. Don't some people drop out of academia?
Yeah. So that's when I started the time series wasn't long enough, but by now I should be able to see, because that's the actual sorting that we're interested in, right? This is more suggestive of just selection.
That selection could be efficient.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But ultimately, so hopefully.
Or maybe you select in, but that's harder. But select out, you might be able to see if the dropout rate of the less productive academics, they're not getting paid as much anymore as they used to.
Yeah,
so presumably
exactly. That's hopefully for future work. So, but I'll stop here.